Alright, hello everybody, welcome back to another one of my item sets. This time we're going to go over the builds that I use for Jungle Malphite. These builds, by the way, are builds that I've spent probably over a year trying to figure out what's the best way to play Malphite in the jungle. And the reason why it's taken so long, and the reason why it's taken so many games to find out, is because Malphite's the kind of champion where if you go full tank, he doesn't really become too useful, and he doesn't really scale too well, especially not against hyper carries. And if you go full damage, he can't do anything against the enemy front line because full damage AP Malphite doesn't actually kill tanks at all. So Glass Cannon Malphite runs into huge problems, and full tank Malphite also runs into huge problems. Not only in terms of team fighting, but also because if you do play tank Malphite, it's very, very hard to actually snowball in solo queue and actually carry, because ultimately, if you want to snowball solo queue, at the end of the day, it is damage that carries the game, and you're just not going to have that. So what I've done is I've ended up coming up with some builds that are kind of in the middle of the road, but not in a very awkward way, more in a sort of solo queue dominant but still doesn't scale too poorly kind of way. So I'm going to go into the actual full item builds and talk about why they have snowball potential and why they work the way they do. But before I do that, and by the way, if they look really weird, don't worry about it, I'll explain all of it. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about the smaller things up here. This is my item set after all, so I do have a bunch of smaller practical items in the top. Oracle's alteration, pretty important for junglers, generally speaking. Control ward is mandatory. I have it in all of my builds. I start Hunters and Refillable Potion or Talisman and Refillable Potion, because Hunter's Machete is not as good for Malphite because he's not really an attack speed champion, and we don't have a ton of attack speed in our runes and masteries. Although I do have some, it's not enough to warrant starting Hunter's Machete. And then I only buy Ionian boots on this guy because Ionian boots are just amazing. One of the major limitations for Malphite jungle is that his ultimate is on such a long cooldown, and he is so ultimate reliant that the problem people run into a lot of the time when they play this guy is that they don't manage to get the proper number of ganks off that they need to get off to snowball solo queue super hard. And the reason why I love Ionian boots so much is because they pretty much solve that problem for you straight up. It's an extremely cheap boot. When you have boots of speed, Ionian boots only cost 600 gold, which is really low, and you get straight up 10% CDR, plus you get the movement speed, plus you get Summoner Spell cooldown, which is not as vital as the flat cooldown reduction, but Summoner Spell cooldown is still really, really nice. It's so good. You're going to be flash ulting people a lot, so it helps. You don't have to go Ionian boots. Like I said, that's just what I do because I think it's just the best, and it's what I have the best experience with. But if you don't want to go Ionian boots, you do have a lot of options because pretty much all of the boots in the game work for Malphite in theory. Of course, Berserker Greaves are going to be the least attractive for our builds because we're not building AD Malphite, so Berserker Greaves don't really make too much sense. Boots of Swiftness, they're kind of like Boots of Mobility, but it's sort of like a combination of Boots of Mobility and Merc Treads. You sort of get the shittiest of both worlds, but you get them in the same boot, so you could go Swiftness if you wanted to. And of course, Boost of Mobility is really, really good for spamming ganks as a jungler. The reason why I wouldn't go with these two boots is just because if you don't have cooldown reduction, you can't really spam ganks anyway, so there's no real reason for you to have this much mobility. What you can do, though, and I would say that this is totally viable, is you can go Sorcerer's Shoes, so that when you finally do gank someone, it hits really, really hard. So that is an option that you have. And I do think Sorcerer's Shoes is better than Mobility and Swiftness. You also have Ninja Tabi and Merc Treads as your other options. These are going to serve you the best in the late game, because in the late game your role is to be in the enemy team's face and be as annoying as humanly possible. and being tanky and having CC resist is just the best way to do that. So those are your options for boots, although like I said, I only use Ionian personally. Oh, and by the way, as far as elixirs go, you can get the AP elixir, but I like to get elixir of iron, and I'll explain why when I get into the actual full item builds. Okay, so when we look at the full item builds, the first thing you probably noticed is that there's actually 6 items instead of 5, and the 6th item in all of the builds is actually Cinderhulk. Now the reason why this is because when you play Jungle Malphite, if you want to snowball the game, you need 2 things in the early game. Well, you need 3 things actually. Number 1 is cooldown reduction, and the way you get that is by going Ionian boots, and by having the setup that I have in my Runes and Masteries, which is in another video, which there's a link in the description for that, so you can check that out. But number 1, you need cooldown reduction. Number 2, you need movement speed, and number 3, you need a shit ton of damage. So what gives you movement speed and damage? Well, Runic Echoes gives you both of those. This is a really good item for Malphite in general. You can do this for full AP Malphite, although that's not what we're doing here. But you can also do what I do and end up with sort of a bruiser-esque kind of snowball build damage at first and then get tanky later kind of Malphite philosophy. And the idea behind it is just that you get the one item that allows for your ganks to hit as hard as they possibly can, while still having enough mobility to get a lot of ganks off. So that's why we go Runic Echoes in all of our builds. And then in the late game, theoretically, in the super late game, if you have all of your items and you have enough gold for it, you can sell your Runic Echoes for a late game Cinderhulk. This will make you a lot more, tanky, obviously. It's going to make team fighting a lot easier for you, but you're not going to one-shot a carry anymore. You will be able to one-shot carries earlier on in the game when you build mostly damage and cooldown reduction, but with Cinderhulk later on, well, you probably couldn't one-shot the carry late game anyway, because that's the point in the game where AD carries and AP carries start building stuff like Zhonya's Hourglass or Guardian Angel, and at that point, full damage Malphite just doesn't do much. So that's why we switch out the Runic Echoes for Cinderhulk if the game goes long enough and if we have enough gold. Which, finally, getting back to it now, we're going full circle, is why we go Elixir of Iron, because the bonus health from Elixir of Iron scales off of, rather, the bonus HP, percentage HP from Cinderhulk, scales off the flat bonus HP from Elixir of Iron. So, there you go. Wow, okay, so let's dive into the individual builds. I have 3 different builds that I use, as you can see. One is focused on magic resist, one is focused on armor, and one is kind of in the middle. If the enemy team has little to no magic damage, if you play Malphite, there's no reason not to go full armor, because Malphite is like the armor champion in the game. Maybe along with Rammus, I would say. So the armor build, we get Runic Echoes so we can kill people and try to snowball the game. We get Iceborne Gauntlet because it gives us the most cooldown reduction possible. Actually, when you have Iceborne Gauntlet, you're pretty much going to have 45% cooldown reduction. At least with my Rune and Mastery setup, you will, because you also have Ionian boots. So it gives us the most cooldown reduction, and it gives us armor at the same time. Plus, it still gives us damage and some extra utility. I would not go Frozen Heart. Not because your E already slows attack speed. The attack speed slow from Frozen Heart is actually pretty nice. But because it doesn't give us any damage at all. And like I said, we want to try to snowball the game. We want to have at least some damage in the early to mid game. And Iceborne is just the perfect item for that. After Iceborne, you're probably going to need some health if you want to not explode, basically. So that's what Deadman's is there for. Also, the extra mobility is kinda nice, and the Crushing Blow damage passive is nothing to write home about, but it is extra damage, I guess. If you're not going Cinderhulk in the hyper late game, if you don't care about Cinderhulk in the slightest, I would suggest that you switch out your Deadman's Plate for a Sunfire Cape because Sunfire Cape deals more damage in the mid-game, and so it's just the better item for the job. However, you can't go both Sunfire Cape and Cinderhulk because they both have the same passive, so that's just not going to work, which is pretty much why we go Dead Man's Plate. After the Dead Man's, we proceed to get even more armor, because the enemy team is, well, very heavy physical damage, and also Thornmail gives us a little bit of extra damage when we get auto-attacked. Lastly, we just go Randuin's into selling Runic Echoes for Cinderhulk, just because it gives you the most armor and health possible. This is the way you get tanky, that's pretty much it. So that's the armor build. It allows you for a lot of snowball potential and half-decent damage in the early mid-game, but not too much damage. The 50-50 build is more damage-oriented, and I actually think this is probably my favorite out of the 3 builds. We start Runic Echoes as always, and we go Iceborne again, because, again, it gives us the cooldown reduction that Malphite needs, and then also gives us armor and a little bit of extra damage, a little bit of extra utility. Really nice. But then, we're gonna need some magic resist, and what better item to give you magic resist and damage than the one and only Wit's End? I know this looks weird, I know some people are gonna think it looks troll. It's not troll, it's fucking great, okay? Wit's End steals magic resist from the enemy team, and pretty much all of your damage is magic damage. Plus, you have to consider the passive from Runic Echoes. That's magic damage too. So, Wit's End is going to amplify all of your damage, and it's going to give you 40 base magic resist, and it's going to give you even more magic resist when you start auto-attacking people. Plus, it will make your auto-attacks with your W active hit really, really hard. Now you might be wondering, if you need magic resistant damage, why aren't you going Abyssal Scepter? Well, the reason why we're not going Abyssal Scepter is because we will overcap on cooldown reduction. And we already have Ionia Boots for 10%, and we have Iceborne, and we have 10% in our runes, so that's 40 right there. So if you go Abyssal Scepter here, it's just a giant fucking waste of money. So that's why we don't go with that item. Also, it doesn't give you as much DPS. It doesn't give you as much raw DPS as Wit's End does. Abyssal Scepter is more of a team fighting kind of item, because it amplifies the magic damage that your team does to the enemy team. So that's why we go Wit's End. After that, we get Dead Man's, for the same reason why we get Dead Man's down here. And again, if you don't care about Cinderhulk, I suggest you go Sunfire Cape instead. Especially because the magic damage from Sunfire Cape in this particular build has synergy with the Wit's End magic resist shred, so it becomes even better. And then lastly, we get a Banshee's Veil because we need the magic resist. If the enemy team has a lot of magic damage, one magic resist item is not enough. We need another one. And Banshees gives us a ton of magic resist, plus some health, which is pretty nice. And again, you might be asking, why aren't you going Spirit Visage? It gives you more health. Well, Spirit Visage, again, like Abyssal Scepter, gives us cooldown reduction, and so, again, it would be a waste. As for the final build, we're going to need some damage, some cooldown reduction, and some magic resist. So, just like the Wit's End buy, we're getting Abyssal Scepter here, but the only difference is just that we don't have any cooldown reduction yet, which means the Abyssal Scepter is actually warranted. We're not getting an Iceborne this time, because we need magic resist in this case, so Abyssal Scepter is just the best option. The other option that you do have in theory, at least for now in the preseason, is Maw of Memordius. It gives you damage, gives you magic resist, and it gives you cooldown reduction, kinda like Abyssal Scepter. So why aren't we doing it? The reason we're not doing it is because it has absolutely jack shit for synergy when it comes to Runic Echoes. At least the ability power from Abyssal Scepter amplifies the passive damage of Runic Echoes, and the damage from Runic Echoes is amplified by the passive of Abyssal Scepter, so the synergy works both ways, which is just beautiful. And then after that, we're going Spirit Visage because we still don't have full CDR, so the extra 10% is actually really nice here. And it gives us a lot of health, pretty good magic resist. The passive is kind of wasted-ish, but, I mean, who cares? A lot of tanks actually buy Spirit Visage just because of the stats that it gives, which are really good. Now, at some point in the game, regardless of how much magic damage the enemy team has, the AD carry is going to start dealing physical damage. So you will need at least 1 or 2 physical, or rather armor items at some point in the game. And if you're only going with one of them, you may as well get the one that deals the most damage and gives you the most armor, which is Thornmail. Plus, you have to consider that the damage that the enemy auto-attacker will be taking from the Thornmail is magic damage, which means, again, it's amplified by Abyssal Scepter. So there's way better synergy between Thornmail and Abyssal Scepter than there is synergy between Iceborne and Abyssal Scepter. Besides, you couldn't go Iceborne anyway. I mean, you already have your cooldown reduction. It's way too late in the game for an Iceborne. So Thornmail is pretty much the best buy here, and then we finish Banshees because it's the only other magic resist item in the game that has health, and we need health. We only have one other health item so far. So that's the full build, and if you want to, like I said, you can sell the Runic Echoes for Cinderhulk in the late game. And the magic damage, the, what's it called? Immolation passive. The Immolation passive from Cinderhulk still has synergy with the aura from Abyssal Scepter, so it's not like you're completely wasting the damage from Runic Echoes. At least it gets replaced by a little bit of burn damage. So yeah, those are the different builds that I use for Malphite in the jungle. These builds, if you play properly, they will allow you to snowball the game crazy hard, and you will not even need to think about selling your Runic Echoes for a Cinderhulk, because the game will be over so fast. However, sometimes your team just doesn't want to win, or sometimes you mess up yourself, and maybe the game goes long enough for a Cinderhulk. Who knows? In any case, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you like what I'm doing here on this channel and you want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon page. There's a link in the description. And if you want to see what runes and masteries I run for whatever this is, I guess you could call it Bruiser Malphite in the jungle. If you want to see the runes and masteries, there's a link in the description for that video as well. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you next time. Peace.